This week on ThyBuzz, Unsolved, we are tackling the unsolved mystery of the haunted labor of the Philippines.
OMG! The haunted labor of the Philippines!
Must be roaring scary!
Well, it is scary. Just imagine the rampant exploitation of the Filipino workers.
It's time that we expose this explosive.
It starts in the 1950s and the 1960s. A lot of major news sites covered the exploitation of the Filipino workers when they started going overseas. After World War II, the establishment of American hospitals in the Philippines and the training of Filipino nurses in Western medicine created a ready labor force of nurses for the US. The exchange visitor program paved the way for the influx of news migration that began that time, and the notion of your cap is your passport exemplified this idea of the development of Filipino nurses to become an international labor force. They were drawn to work in the US to escape poor working conditions in hospitals in the Philippines, hoping to transform themselves through travel. However, this was not the case as nurses experienced hospital exploitation as their salary was only a fraction compared to the salaries of US nurses. Some were assigned to work on the front lines with the most laborious and high-risk tasks. Furthermore, recruitment agencies and sponsoring hospitals took advantage of the romanticized views of working in the United States by the nurses. Filipino nurse migration is still an ongoing process, as Filipino-American nurses make up 4% of the nationwide nurse population. As this systemic labor export continues, so does their experiences of exploitation, which is especially exacerbated during the pandemic. With this disproportionate death toll of Filipino-American nurses, it is a call to grapple with the complex history of Filipino nurse migration and how we can better provide care for the ones who take care of us.
In a report by R. Howens of the Washington Post in 1986, the exploitation of Filipino workers drastically continued during the absolutely horrific regime of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr. And just like that of other third world countries, from industrialized South Africa to the developing nations of Asia, the economic progression has been at the expense of the workers' human rights. According to the International Labor Rights Working Group, employers under Marcos commonly hired private squadrons of ex-soldiers to spy on, harass, or attack workers as a way of enforcing discipline in the factories. All told, 42 union activists have been killed since 1982 for their involvement in labor activities. As part of the feudal system installed by Marcos for the benefit of his family and his cronies, he banned strikes in so-called vital industries, which included all those producing goods for export.
10 years later, on the other side of the world, the USA's workforce grew exponentially as wages rose, fringe benefits grew, and working conditions improved. The average work week changed dramatically from 53 hours to 42 hours. Additional benefits averaged $5.58 per hour, which is approximately $2 more on their previous average hourly pay. Also, female participation in the labor market grew dramatically, jumping from 19% to 60%. Despite these, child labor became the new trend. About 1.75 million Americans aged 10 to 15 were gainful workers as their families needed more income to survive. These children were 6% of USA's workforce at the time, and there were no federal laws to combat child labor until year 1999.
Wow, that was heavy.
Well, that is heavy news, but are we really surprised? What do we expect from the infamous dictator's reign?
The growth of USA's economy, though, how I wish it were the same for the Philippines. Except for child labor, of course.
I hate to say this, but it just gets worse. This time, at the hands of his own son.
Traveling back to the adjacent present times, the 2020s or the COVID-19 pandemic era of the Philippines, child labor became much more rampant in the country. According to the Philippine Statistics Authority, nearly 50,000 or 4% of about 1.4 million Filipino domestic workers are minors. The government figures reveal that almost 5,000 of them were aged 14 or under. In an article by J.P. Calleja in 2020 for the Union of Catholic Asian News, children have become collateral damage from the pandemic as families are forcing them to work under tedious conditions and in life-threatening environments. ILO Director General Guy Ryder said that in times of crisis, social protection is essential because it helps the most vulnerable people, making child labor issues part of more comprehensive strategies for international human and labor rights, justice, social protection, labor markets, and education makes a significant difference. And although the issue may be challenging, the government and all aspects of society must work to put a stop to it since it exposes children to future exploitation. But is that what they're actually doing?
Of course, they're trying their best.
Haha, if that's what helps you sleep at night. And how can we forget about our frontliners during this pandemic?
This pandemic has led to many consequences on health systems and populations, including shortage of workers, reduction in services provided, increases in errors and poorer quality of care delivered, and longer waiting times for essential services. HCWs were forced to work longer hours with suboptimal and inadequate pay and protective equipment. Increasing infection among hospital staff members pushed the Philippine health system at the brink of collapse. This prompted the government to impose a temporary overseas travel ban, which was heavily protested by several HCW unions. The salary differential is particularly glaring. The annual income of a first-year medical resident in the Philippines is average at 720,000 pesos, while their counterparts in the US earn 3 billion pesos. Entry-level and private hospital nurses receive even less, averaging 10,000 pesos a month, when household expenditure is average at 19,886 pesos. Filipino HCWs express concerns about cultural differences, discrimination, workplace abuse, and loss of social support. However, despite these apprehensions and the inherent dedication to culture and community, many are pushed to live for personal ambitions and familial obligations. It is heartbreaking how this problem is evident and still growing in our country. How can we solve this?
Hi, Tito Boy. I know, right? I actually have the same question too.
Now, to get a little bit more in depth with our discussion, let's talk about St. John Paul II's Laborem Exercens, written in 1981 about human work. So, when great numbers of people are unemployed, migrant workers are exploited. Therefore, both capitalist and communist systems exploit the worker. In St. John Paul II's third encyclical, this is the first of his several encyclicals. This was published on September 14, 1981. This encyclical offers the most comprehensive treatment of human work in the corpus of Catholic social teaching. So St. Paul is so nice. I love St. Paul.
It attempts to convey the idea that work is an integral aspect of man's vocation and dignity and is comparable to taking part in God's creative process since it includes a spiritual component. With this, decent wages, rights, and benefits of workers must be assured. Work must support the family, with working mothers receiving special consideration. To also ensure that disabled people can participate in the dignity of labor, further measures must be adopted.
So for the first theme of the Laborem Exercens, we have the objective and subjective components of work. Subjective dimension refers to the aspect of work that allows the human person to realize himself or herself. So therefore, on the other hand, objective component of work refers to the kind of work that the person does, which is measured by its monetary returns. Second theme is a warning against economism. Laborem Exercens, written by St. John Paul II, reminds us to be careful with the error of economism. That is, of equating the dignity and value of our work with the financial incentives that it gives in return.
So the next theme will be the role of indirect employers. It specifically calls our attention to the reality of indirect employers, which includes both persons and instructions of various kinds, and also collective labor contracts and the principles of contracts and the principle of conduct, which are laid down by these persons and institutions in which the whole socio-economic system are its result. Next will be the family wage as just wage. Just wage is family wage. LA categorically defines just remuneration for the work of an adult who is responsible for a family to be sufficient for establishing and properly maintaining a family and for providing security for its future.
We now move on to the support for workers' unions. Unions must resist the urge to align themselves with political partisanship and exercise caution to avoid being misused and used for other people's political objectives.
And lastly, the spirituality of work. Laborem Exercens' profound contribution is to make its readers realize that the work that we do is not only for the means of self-realization, but is even our way of participating in the paschal mystery of Christ. which is like the workers' participation in Christ's suffering, death on the cross, and resurrection. And that's all for today's episode.
While this case remains unsolved, I hope you guys learn one thing or two.
See you next week for more.
Explosive, exclusive, expose. This has been ThyBuzz. Unsolved.